There are so many tales concerning the times of old that it is impossible to judge which stories are true and which ones are merely fictions created to entertain little children. All the old histories were lost, and the gaping void left by ignorance was filled with conjecture and fantasy. There are said to be books held by the learned which say that the men of today carry in their veins the blood of many lost races. I have been told that the stocky, bearded men of the North Country are descendants of a people who mined and built great machines in the icy, barren wastelands. The thin hunters and fishermen of the high woodlands are whispered to be the distant relations of a lost empire of fairies. All these tales are well and good to amuse children, but the simple fact remains that they are only men, and whatever spells may have been cast in some bygone era, they are all just tales now. Even as a child, I had sense enough to not to believe these fantasies, but odd as it may seem, now as an adult, I have come to question my own doubt. As a younger woman, I was wed to a sheriff. He was beholden to maintain the laws of our town, and he was a fine and decent man to my any standard. However, it was from his two sisters, Greta and Bertina, that I was first to learn of a secret art passed on through generations of their family. Both of these women had in their kitchens large tomes which they referred to simply as their cookbooks. It was during my first year of marriage, while we were preparing the Yuletide feast, that I noticed several odd pages within Greta's enormous volume. "What recipes are these?" I asked as I studied the strange drawings and notes. Greta gave Bertina a look over her shoulder as she stirred gravy in a pot on their fine gas stove. "Those aren't recipes, dear," she answered casually. "Then what are they?" I was smiling, but Greta's watchful expression gave me the feeling that this was a serious matter. "They are formulas," she answered, looking back into the bubbling brown mixture. "What on earth is that?" "Oh, just helpful oddities passed down in our family through the generations by the womanfolk." Bertina said this as she looked over my shoulder. "Just like that one, which is a draught to alleviate the pain of the monthly red." "Does it work?" I said, astonished, as I gazed at the strange numbers and plants illustrated in a carefully practiced hand. "Oh yes, quite well. Not only will you feel better, but the flow will lessen and end much sooner." "Do you have any?" I asked with astonishment. "Why, of course. I always make a batch by the full moon." Greta was smiling now and seemed pleased with my interest. "Can I have some?" "Even better. I will show you how to make it." "What other formulas do you have?" I was now flipping through the pages. Greta wiped her hands on her apron and put them on my shoulders as she turned to me and gently said, "Many more, dear Melissa. But you must know that all of this is in the strictest of confidence. You must never speak of our cookbooks to anyone." "Even Warwick?" I said with great horror. "But he is my husband." I looked back with amusement now at the naivety I had as a girl of 17. But understand that Greta and Bertina were both women of a much older age, and I had come to idolize the wisdom they had accumulated in their long years. Greta was a respected wife at some 45 years old, and Bertina was older still by 3. Especially to Warwick. These are women's secrets, and by women they must be kept. I thought of that long first year of marriage, and how invaluable the kindness and advice of my in-law sisters had been. I had no sisters of my own, and my mother had died in labor, bringing me into the world. "But don't men ever look in these books?" I whispered. "Melissa," Bertina said as she petted my hair kindly. "Men do not come into the kitchen but to sample dinner." "Just as they only come to bed to sample what's beneath your belly," Greta added. I laughed and they embraced me. I had never felt so much part of a family, and I knew that I would do anything to continue within their trust. That night we sat drinking wine and eating what was left of the dinner after all the other family members and children snored about the house in warm piles of blankets and every available couch and chair. Bertina rose, brushing her long golden tinted brown hair over her shoulders, and took a clean new book from a place in the cupboard. She sat back down and gazed at me with shining clear blue eyes as she pushed the book across the table until it sat by my plate of half-eaten apple pie and crumbs of honey cake. Outside, the cold winter wind blew against the walls of the kitchen with a soft, ghostly wail. "This is your gift of Yuletide from us," she giggled. I opened it to find the pages clean and blank as new fallen snow. Greta took my hand in her long, thin fingers. "Every time you visit, we will give you 2 recipes, one for food and one for something else." Over the following years, the 2 sisters held true to their word, and steadily, with each passing season, the pages of my cookbook became filled with the various delicious delicacies and an equal number of charms, chants, and potions. There were recipes for chicken and wild hare, along with songs one could sing to spooked horses and frightened livestock that would quiet their terror. I had a savory potato soup on the opposite page, beside a symbol you could draw in dust, which would keep mice from the pantry. Listed on another page were the ingredients for a cake of walnuts and molasses, above a potion made of molding bread which could stave off infection in wounds and sickness. As time wore on, I was privy to a greater and greater knowledge of healing arts and warding charms. Every year, on the autumnal solstice, we would journey far into a clearing in the woods, and there we would build a massive bonfire and by it place jugs of whiskey before we would slaughter 3 pigs and leave them gutted by the flames. Then with our brooms, we would draw a great circle around the fire and draw symbols in the dirt with the tips of the handles. This was so that on the night of the winter's birth, when the spirit world drew so close to that of the living that the dead may cross, the spirits would be drawn to this private feast, not to the homes of the living. "Are the dead so vengeful?" I had asked, as I poured whiskey into the jars we had set out. "Not all," Bertina replied, as she placed another log on the fire. "But there are those who have gone mad, and they seek only destruction and sorrow for the living. Besides, there are other things to fear this night," Greta added, as she carefully inspected the runes as to be sure that they were drawn properly. "There are dark gods of the older days, which still roam in the wilderness and bottomless caves of the wood. Mostly they slumber, but on this night, the smell of the living drifts into the other realm and awakens them. That is why we build the fire far in the woods to draw them in. Once they cross into the circle, they are bound to stay until morning. In the light of the dawn, they will be forced to return to their den, and there they will remain for another year." I dared not speak what thoughts crossed my mind to the sisters. Secretly, I found this to be the most fantastic and unbelievable of all the things which I had learned. The following day, word spread through the village that a group of hunters had been found slain in a clearing in the wood. It was said they had been feasting at a fire and had been attacked by some ravenous animal. Later, when I saw Greta in town at the hairdresser's, she took me to the side and whispered, "They dared to partake of the feast we left, and paid with their flesh. Never again would I make light of the lore which the sisters had taught me." Many years passed, and in time my cookbook was full. With the aid of the forgotten lore therein, my life had been blessed and my family prospered. I had successfully delivered 5 children with far less pain than many women could claim. My house was safe and my children healthy. My husband had been elected the mayor, and it seemed as if I had woven a thick tapestry of good fortune around all whom I loved. Still, every year in autumn, me, Bertina, and Greta made our way deep into the forest and built the great circle at which the spirits could come feast. I had learned that this strange tradition had been practiced by the daughters, both of blood and of marriage in their family, going back into times forgotten. By this time, I had 2 daughters of my own, of whom I had expected to teach our lost arts at the time of their womanhood. Although Greta had been cursed to bear only sons, Bertina had a daughter, who already was learning the ways of the coven. It would be on this unruly and arrogant girl that the weight of the future destruction would fall. The dark child's name was Karamia, and all her love and devotion had by some strange turn fallen to her father, the construction contractor Brogan. Brogan was a stubborn and simple man given to bouts of anger and foul melancholy. It was to him that at long last our secret was betrayed for no better reason than Bertina's refusal to allow Karamia a pretty bauble in the dime store. Even I had warned Bertina of the girl's stupidity and recklessness, but a mother's love can be blind. Brogan and a group of townsmen fell upon Bertina as she lay sleeping, and soon had captured fair Greta as well. It was only by the grace of my husband's soft heart that he sent me fleeing into the wilds with my daughters before the mob could take us. In my husband's new sedan, we drove along the mossy banks of the river, crossed into the country called the Dust Plain. I had been told by my in-law sisters that long ago this had been the origin of the wife's art, as we called it. For this great expanse of grassy land surrounded the vast and imposing peak, which was called by all those who knew of it as the Dark Mountain. The land was kept by the state as a wildlife reserve, and here we would hide for a time while I considered our future. I was told that when we cast charms to ward off great evils, it was that which lurked in the deep heart of the mountain which we were warding away. Old tales from the hill country told of a people who lived in the honeycomb of caves which dotted the black walls of the peak. They had been a wretched and evil lot, whose blood had intermingled with the loathsome things they worshipped, and in time had lost their last vestige of humanity. The wives of farmers and hunters of the plain had devised many protective means by which to hold these things at bay, and this was the origin of our craft. Finding an abandoned vacationer's cabin, I made a temporary home there in the wilderness, and began the schooling of my daughters in the ways of magic. I had no knowledge that the hatred and ignorance of the men of our town would lead them to follow us, even there to the farthest edge of the world. A season passed as we struggled alone in the small, sparsely furnished cabin home we had made in the hills. We fished in the streams and found a pantry of canned goods with enough to feed ourselves sufficiently. However, as the summer waned and the wind grew cold, I began to dream of a darkness rising within the distant mountain. I had just begun teaching my daughters the atonement ritual when we first saw smoke rising from the woods to the north, and I knew that someone was coming. It was in the early morning hours when we first heard the barking of dogs and the shouts of men. They came driving up a path from the woods carrying guns and bats as they approached the dim red light of dawn. I rushed Tricia and Hetty to the car, and we fled the throng of angry townspeople in the only direction left for us to escape. I found myself driving in terror up the overgrown dirt road for the lives of myself and my children towards the Dark Mountain. In the shadow of the peak, the land had become a barren, mossy bog as we crossed through the twisted blackwood trees into the rocky hills beyond. All around us, I could feel the dense taint of ancient evil as we left our car and began to struggle through the jagged rocks towards the empty mouth of a small cave. I stood at the opening and could almost sense the corruption erupting from within like a foul wind of putrid energy. In the sky, I could see the great autumn moon hanging low in opposition to the rising sun, and knew that this day was leading into the night of the solstice. There would be no campfire set with the slaughtered pigs and whiskey. There would be no circle of containment in which to trap whatever darkness was now awakening below. I had only one small hope, that with the spells of protection I had learned and practiced over the many years, I might keep us safe, even here in the heart of the darkness. Strewn throughout the tunnels were the remains of the wicked lost culture which had dwelt here in the Forgotten Age. Dust-covered bones and decrepit cages set by deep pits marked every open cavern as we traveled further within. I could not imagine the type of men which could have lived in any kind of harmony with the spoiled stone of these long meandering passages. We came upon a massive cavern, and in the center stood a crumbling throne carved from one of the great jagged rocks which reached up from the floor. Here there had once sat a horrid king presiding over the filth of his domain. Before this seat was an expansive depth which dwarfed all other pits we had seen. At its edges were deep marks, clawed into the edges as if something of a size and ferocity beyond comprehension had clawed its way out. Any hope that I might have had that the denizen of this pit existed no longer was dispelled by the unsettling and tragic air which I felt rising from within that hole. Already the darkness around us had begun to stir with the seething presence of spirits writhing in the shadows at every corner of this chamber. They were coming closer, not as if physically drawing nearer through space, but reaching through the thin veil between worlds as they ripped and tore at the membrane between the real and the unreal. At times I thought I could glimpse disembodied shapes appearing like dim wisps of smoke in the ebony liquid black. I shouted to my weeping daughters to snap them from their terror and commanded them to help in the construction of our protective circle. The barrier, which would be all that would stand between us and the horrors which were now slowly awakening. We sat huddled within the circle as the stillness of the caverns grew even quieter, and yet increasing in the cold, restless storm which brewed around us. As my daughters wept, I held them and told them to close their eyes so as not to gaze upon the things which formed around us. There were things which now crawled from the cracks in the stone. Shaped oddly like men, they scurried along the rocks like a multitude of twisted appendages. I could see glints of light from their eyes, even though there was no source from which that luminescence could be reflected. Some were long and segmented, like the many-legged creatures you might find upon turning over a rotted log in the forest, while still others were plated in a gray, bone-like armor over flesh and underbodies which were pale and all too human. I held my breath and thanked every god and spirit that might be watching these creatures with their faint, dripping mouths did not seem to see us, weeping in our circle of salt and silver dust. "What are they?" whispered brave Hetty, who had dared to open her eyes and witness the monstrosities which swarmed beneath a cloud of ghosts in the chamber. I was told by the sisters that long ago the people who dwelt here had taken the poison of the demons into their blood. For a time they married and coupled, as would any race, but their greed to maintain the purity of their power led them to marry only their own, and in time the effect of the taint on their blood distorted the flesh of the newborn. There were those chosen from among them to go out into the world and marry into the world of pure men, and thereby pass on all their traditions of evil and depravity. This caused the downfall of the great older world, which most do not even remember now. The wife priests who lived on the plain gathered at the fall of that era and used the art with which they had learned to cast a spell of slumber on the dark mountain, so that these things could never plague the world again. However, on the night of the autumnal solstice, they may awaken and go forth into the world to wreak misery on the descendants of those which imprisoned them. Even as I spoke these words, I could see the light of torches dancing on the walls of the entrance to the chamber. They were calling our names in harsh, angry voices as their approach froze the creatures within the cave in their place. I watched in horror as the collective horde drew back into the darkest shadows and knew that they planned on falling over the hunting party in a wave after they had fully centered. "What's this then?" a voice was saying. "I see smoke ahead. They cannot be far." Little did they suspect that the smoke, which they now glimpsed, was a maelstrom of twisted, horrifying spirits which swam ravenous and vengeful overhead. As they entered, their torches lit the cavern, but still the creatures were still and waiting as they stomped and pushed into the cave, looking for us. There were nearly 30 in all, spreading out with bats and guns, drawn as they approached. After a few moments, I saw the leader of the group, none other than Brogan, as he stepped around a boulder and gazed upon us with hateful, mocking eyes. "I have found them," he shouted hoarsely as the others began to gather round. "You must go," I said in a low voice barely above a whisper. "You are all in great danger." "Aye, lady, I think it is you who is in a world of trouble," he laughed as the others began to bring ropes, while others leveled their rifles. "Why don't you just step out here and come with us, and we'll be as gentle as lambs to your young ones before the burning." "You cursed fools! You have no idea where you are. Can you not feel what lies waiting all around you? Hold your tongue, witch. You'll not scare us as you did my little girl with your stories. That black-hearted child will be the death of you, Brogan, and you deserve nothing less for what you did to your wife." My rage had simmered far too long, and now my disgust with these men and their vile ignorance had boiled. "She loved you and cared for you all those years, and you betray her. You repay her with betrayal. Fate has witnessed that I tried to save you from your stupidity. Can you not see the ghosts have come to claim you?" I pointed over their heads, and a few men did look up to see the swirling mist of bodies and long tendrils of smoky, distorted forms as they stifled the light of the torches and left us all in the darkness before the gleaming, watchful eyes in the blackness. "It's a spell, Brogan," one of the men yelled. "They've conjured the dead to protect them." It was then I heard a scream as something lunged from the cavern's corner and pulled one of the men down into one of the dark pits. "They'll kill you all," I cried. "Run, you fools, and seek what is left of the daylight." But the army of twisted apparitions was descending along the walls in a thick, unholy swarm as the men tried to fend them off. Their blasts of gunfire, which echoed throughout the cathedral dome of the chamber as the sounds of limbs being ripped away like wheat at harvest, filled my ears. It seemed as if the screams of the terrified hunters had excited the beasts into frenzy as they began to make growling, shrieking sounds of pleasure and glee at their dark work. Brogan had fallen back as he gazed into the pitch blanket of horror which surrounded him. "Call them off and make this stop, woman," he said to me over his shoulder as his trembling hands raised the rifle in his arms. He was almost at the edge of our circle when we heard a deep, horrible grinding, like some machination of dementia rising from the great pit which stretched before the throne. "By the Blessed Virgin, what is it?" he stammered as he raised his gun to aim at the apocalyptic shadow which was looming before us as a moving mountain of twisting, lashing tentacles and biting, savage mouths. The god of the dark mountain had awakened. In his terror, Brogan fired one shot into the impenetrable night which had fallen. I watched as something snapped from the air and snatched him up in one quick movement. In the blind darkness, there was only his screams to tell the tale of what was befalling him. I held my girls close and began to whisper the words of an ancient song I had learned years ago in the kitchen with my in-law sisters. Night upon night, and hand over hand, moon will break darkness, and water breaks sand. Light over light, and hammer strikes nail. Dawn always comes, and our circle won't fail. We had survived the night. We had watched as the denizens of the mountain made their way into the world, and then saw as they returned, sluggish and fearful, to the dark crevices where they slumbered. When finally the caverns had all been once more veiled in tired, desperate quiet, we at last left the circle. We made our way across the plains and drove along for days until we had finally crested a hill which overlooked the valley in which the little town I had once called home lay destroyed. Every door and every window lay shattered and broken, drenched in blood, now grown cold in the chill autumn air. Cars lay turned on their sides, and picket fences smashed to the pieces in the wake of the onslaught from the putrid invading army. We made our way through streets now bereft of any life or movement other than the feeding of crows on the scraps of flesh which dangled from the gutters and trees like moss. I went to the homes of my in-law sisters, first to Greta's to collect her book, and then on to Bertina's. It was there in the kitchen of the tiny, ravaged cottage that we found Karamia, huddled within a circle of white dust she had drawn on the floor, her mother's book open before her. When she saw us enter, she looked up with wild eyes fiery with madness and terror. Then she smiled with an unsettling, craven quality which turned my stomach. "You've come for me," she said, weeping. "I drew the circle just as Mother taught me. When the Dark Ones came, they took everyone else but me. I knew someone would come, I knew." I looked upon her and spoke not a word. I lifted the book from the floor and closed it as I handed it to Tricia. "You should go to the mountain and crawl into a hole with the others like yourself," I said as I took my daughters under my arms and led them back through the unhinged screen door of the kitchen. "But you cannot leave me here," she heard her cry. "I'm one of you. I'm family. I didn't know, Aunt Melissa. I didn't know the men would kill them. I just wanted to scare her." "And scare her you did," I replied from outside as I gazed at her pleading in the ruins of her mother's sacred kitchen. "And now it is your turn to be scared, dear child." I turned to her and spoke 3 simple words of the ancient tongue, thereby causing the circle she had made to hold her from falling. She held and wept as she beat at the invisible barrier until she crumbled a heap of misery and helplessness. As we walked from the ruin of our town, night falling cold with grim finality, I could see the gray shapes of wolves, stray dogs, and coyotes making their way along the road, drawn by the smell of blood to the wreckage in the valley. As Tricia, Hetty, and I sat warm in our car by the road, listening to the radio that night, I looked at my daughters and said, "They will find at least one meal left in the town when they arrive." And they laughed.